He told me I was not on his level. Then I showed everyone proof of who really was beneath. Hi everyone! Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I still remember the exact moment my world shifted. Not crumbled, shifted. Like when you're looking at one of those optical illusions and suddenly see the hidden image that was there all along. It was Marcus's company launch party. 3 years of his startup journey, and I'd been there for every late night, every investor pitch, every moment of doubt when he'd curl up next to me and whisper about his dreams of changing the fintech world. I'd held his head while he threw up from stress before the Series A presentation. I'd proofread every deck, celebrated every small win, and quietly absorbed every criticism he had for me along the way. The criticisms had started small, almost gentle. Maybe try something a bit more polished for the networking event tonight? He'd suggest, looking at my favorite vintage blazer, the one I'd thrifted and had tailored to fit perfectly. Or, your Instagram aesthetic is kind of all over the place. Successful people have consistent personal brands. I'd begun second-guessing everything. My clothes, my career choices, my friends, even my hobbies. When I showed him a poem I'd written about urban loneliness that had gotten featured in a small literary magazine, he'd patted my head like I was a child showing him finger paintings. That's sweet, babe. Maybe someday you can turn your writing into something more substantial, like copywriting for tech companies or something. I should have seen the pattern then. Every accomplishment of mine became a stepping stone to something he deemed more worthy. Every dream I shared got filtered through his lens of what constituted real success. Your outfit is a bit basic for tonight, don't you think? He'd said as we got ready for the launch party. I was wearing a black midi dress from Zara. Nothing fancy, but it fit well and made me feel confident. This is going to be full of VCs and tech journalists. Maybe wear the Reformation dress I got you? The Reformation dress that was 2 sizes too small because he'd guessed my size wrong and never bothered to exchange it. Oh. The one that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The one that still had the tags on it, hanging in our closet like a monument to his attention to detail. This dress is fine, Marcus. It's professional and... Professional? He laughed. That particular laugh that always made my stomach clench. Not the genuine laugh I'd fallen in love with, but this performance laugh he'd developed somewhere along the way. Babe, you're not going to a job interview. This is about projecting success. Image matters in Silicon Valley. These people make snap judgments in the first 30 seconds. He adjusted his Tom Ford tie, the one I'd helped him pick out and secretly paid for because his startup salary was mostly equity and promises. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. I should have stayed home that night. Should have trusted the knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter for months. Instead, I changed into a navy blazer and pants, the safest choice I could think of. Conservative enough to avoid his criticism, professional enough to blend in with his world. The Uber ride to the venue was tense. Marcus spent the entire 20-minute journey on his phone, responding to Slack messages and checking his LinkedIn engagement metrics. I watched the city blur past through the window and tried to remember the last time we'd had a conversation that wasn't about his company, his goals, his vision for the future. When had I become just an accessory to his ambition? The party was everything Marcus had promised. Sleek venue in Soma with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, craft cocktails with names like Disruption and Unicorn Tears, people who spoke in acronyms and threw around terms like product market fit and growth hacking with the casual authority of insiders. Marcus was in his element immediately, floating between groups with that confident smile I'd once found so attractive. Now it looked calculated, performative. I watched him activate what I'd started thinking of as his networking mode. The slightly deeper voice, the more expansive gestures, the way he'd drop casual mentions of his company's valuation and recent TechCrunch coverage. I tried to blend in, nursing a $12 cocktail and listening to conversations about cryptocurrency volatility and the latest Y Combinator batch. The drink tasted like expensive gin and my own discomfort. A few people asked what I did, and when I mentioned I was a freelance content writer working on launching my poetry blog, I could see their interest evaporate in real time. In Marcus's world, if you weren't building something scalable, if you weren't chasing venture capital or disrupting an industry, you were essentially invisible. "Oh, creative industries," one woman said with a tight smile, before excusing herself to get another drink. She was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my rent, and her dismissal felt casual, practiced. I wondered how many other creative types she'd discarded in similar conversations. Another man, when he learned I wasn't in tech, immediately started talking over me to someone behind me about blockchain applications. I might as well have been furniture. Marcus kept introducing me as his girlfriend, but never quite including me in the actual conversations. I'd stand there, invisible, while he networked and name-dropped and painted himself as this visionary entrepreneur who'd bootstrapped his way to success. The irony is that I knew the real story. I'd been there for all of it. I'd been there when his parents' small loan of $50,000, described to everyone else as a small friends and family round, saved the company from bankruptcy in month 6. I'd watched him take credit for Sarah's algorithm optimization that actually made their product work, pushing her out of the company 3 months later when she started asking for proper recognition. I'd seen him buy followers on LinkedIn and engagement on his posts, then screenshot the metrics to send to investors as proof of his thought leadership. I'd watched him hire a VA from Fiverr to leave positive comments on his content, creating the illusion of organic community engagement. I knew about the fake testimonials on their website, written by Marcus himself using different names and stock photos. I knew about the inflated user numbers in their pitch deck, achieved by counting every single sign-up, even ones that never completed onboarding or used the product once. But I stayed quiet. Good girlfriends support their partners, right? They don't correct them in public or point out inconsistencies. They smile and nod and let their boyfriends shine. They make themselves smaller so their partners can appear larger. I'd internalized his criticism so completely that I'd begun to believe it myself. Maybe my work wasn't important. Maybe my dreams were naive. Maybe I was lucky that someone as ambitious and successful as Marcus had chosen someone like me. Except I was also the one who'd been ghostwriting his thought leadership LinkedIn articles, because his natural writing style, read like a business textbook, had mated with a motivational poster. I was the one who developed the content strategy that grew his personal brand from 2,000 to 45,000 followers. I was the one who'd researched competitors and wrote the market analysis that became the foundation of his investor presentations. I was the one paying for our fancy dinners and weekend trips, because his equity-heavy compensation meant his actual paycheck barely covered his share of rent in my apartment. But somehow, in his narrative and increasingly in my own mind, I was the one who wasn't contributing enough. The party continued around us, a blur of networking conversations and startup pitches disguised as casual chat. I found myself drifting toward the edges of groups, smiling politely while people discussed markets I didn't understand, and opportunities I'd never be invited to participate in. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was standing near the dessert table, actually hiding there, if I'm being honest, taking a break from the performance of being Marcus's supportive girlfriend. He was across the room talking to a group that included TechCrunch's senior reporter and 2 investors I recognized from his pitch meetings. Power players in his world, the kind of people who could make or break a startup with a single tweet or check. I should have stayed by the dessert table, should have kept my distance and let him work his magic without me there as a potential liability. But something drew me over. Maybe curiosity, maybe a desire to finally be included in his professional world, maybe just the masochistic impulse to subject myself to more subtle dismissal. The group was discussing exit strategies and IPO timelines when the TechCrunch reporter noticed me approaching. He had the sort of artificially friendly demeanor that journalists develop for networking events, genuinely interested in stories, but always calculating which conversations might lead to useful information. "Marcus, are you thinking about IPO timeline? Your girlfriend must be excited about potentially being with the next tech billionaire," he said with a grin that was meant to be charming, but felt predatory. I felt my cheeks flush. I hated being talked about like I wasn't there. Hated the implication that my primary interest in Marcus was financial. Hated the casual assumption that his success would automatically become my success. But Marcus's response was so much worse than anything I'd been prepared for. His laugh was different this time. Sharper, more performative. The laugh of someone who'd been given an opportunity to establish hierarchy and wasn't going to waste it. "Oh, Emma's great and all, but let's be honest, she's not really on my level. I mean, she writes blog posts for pet food companies and thinks Instagram poetry is going to make her the next Rupi Kaur." The group chuckled. Not malicious laughter, but the uncomfortable chuckles people make when they're witnessing something awkward and don't know how to respond. I need someone who understands what I'm building here, someone who gets the bigger picture. The world went very quiet, not actually quiet. The party continued around us, music and laughter and clinking glasses. But for me, everything stopped. I felt heat creep up my neck, that particular burning shame that starts in your chest and radiates outward until your whole body feels like it's on fire. The group was looking at me now with a mixture of pity and awkwardness. The reporter had the decency to look uncomfortable. One of the investors was suddenly very interested in his phone. Marcus kept talking, oblivious to or ignoring the shift in energy. Don't get me wrong, she's supportive and everything. But when you're trying to scale a company, you need a partner who operates at the same strategic level. Someone who can contribute to the conversation about market dynamics and growth strategies. Someone who can contribute to the conversation. The same conversations I'd been having with him in private for 3 years. The same strategies I'd helped develop. The same market analysis I'd researched and written. The same growth tactics I'd implemented for his personal brand. But apparently, when those contributions came from someone who also wrote poetry and freelanced for pet food companies, they didn't count as real strategic thinking. I managed to excuse myself without making a scene. Years of being trained to be polite, to not cause problems, to prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own dignity served me well in that moment. I smiled tightly, murmured something about getting some air, and walked away on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. I found the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection in the harsh LED lighting. My eyes were bright with unshed tears, my cheeks flushed with humiliation. The navy blazer I'd chosen for its safety suddenly looked exactly as Marcus had described. Basic, unremarkable, the outfit of someone who wasn't quite good enough for the room she was trying to fit into. But underneath the hurt, underneath the familiar spiral of self-doubt and shame, something else was stirring. Something cold and calculating and absolutely furious. I'd spent 3 years making myself smaller to fit into Marcus's vision of success. 3 years being told my dreams weren't practical enough, my career wasn't impressive enough, my background wasn't prestigious enough for his world. 3 years of being grateful that someone like him had chosen someone like me. 3 years of believing that his definition of worth was more valid than my own. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. Started typing. He said I'm not on his level, while standing on a foundation built from my uncredited work, my unpaid emotional labor, my carefully managed silence. The words came quickly, almost automatically. Not polished poetry, just raw truth spilling onto the screen. I splashed cold water on my face, reapplied my lipstick, and walked back out to the party with a smile. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. The performance of being Marcus's supportive girlfriend suddenly felt exactly like that, a performance. And I was tired of playing a role that required me to diminish myself. I spent the rest of the party observing instead of participating. Watching Marcus work the room with his practiced charm, listening to him tell stories I knew weren't entirely true, seeing how easily the crowd accepted his version of reality. But I also started noticing other things. The way he name-dropped people he'd met once and described as close advisors. The way he inflated metrics and downplayed problems. The way he took credit for ideas that had come from his team. From me. By the time we got home that night, I'd made a decision. Not a decision to break up with him. Not a decision to confront him about what he'd said. A much more strategic decision than that. I was going to document everything. The next 3 weeks were the most productive of my life, though Marcus never noticed. He was too busy riding the high from his launch party, following up with the connections he'd made, planning his next fundraising round. I started small and methodical. Downloaded all our shared Google Docs, the ones where I'd brainstormed product positioning, researched competitors, drafted his investor updates. Screenshots of our conversations about work, evidence of every idea he'd claimed as his own. The email trail was particularly damning. Months of exchanges where he'd asked me to research competitors and write summaries that later became his original insights in investor presentations. Messages where he'd specifically asked me to write this in my voice for his LinkedIn posts, then publish them without any acknowledgement. I had 3 years' worth of evidence showing that what he dismissed as blog posts for pet food companies was actually sophisticated content strategy that had built his entire personal brand. I reached out to Sarah, the engineer he'd pushed out 6 months earlier. We'd only met a few times, but I remembered her as brilliant and dedicated, exactly the kind of person Marcus felt threatened by. She'd left abruptly after what Marcus described as personality conflicts and not being a good cultural fit. The real story was more complicated. Sarah had developed the core algorithm that made Marcus's product actually work. She'd put in months of unpaid overtime perfecting the code while Marcus networked and gave interviews about his technical vision. When she started asking for proper recognition, not just financial compensation, but acknowledgement of her contribution to the product, Marcus had systematically undermined her. He'd excluded her from client meetings where her work was being discussed, started questioning her technical decisions in front of other team members, eventually created a hostile enough environment that she'd felt she had no choice but to leave. But Sarah had been documenting everything too. She had code commits with timestamps, email threads about technical decisions, Slack conversations where Marcus had claimed credit for her innovations. She'd been too intimidated to speak up at the time, afraid of being labeled difficult or vindictive, but 3 weeks of my carefully worded questions had her ready to go on record. "I thought I was going crazy," she told me over coffee in a quiet cafe in Oakland. "He made me feel like I was being oversensitive, like I was imagining things. But you're right, it was systematic. He took credit for everything I built and then pushed me out when I started asking for recognition." She pulled out her laptop and showed me the evidence. Months of work, clearly documented, all attributed to Marcus in the company's official narrative. "Why didn't you say anything publicly when you left?" I asked. Sarah laughed bitterly. "Are you kidding? A woman engineer accusing a charismatic male founder of stealing her work? I would have been blacklisted from the industry. At least this way I could find another job." I understood that calculation completely. The same calculation I'd been making for 3 years every time I'd swallowed criticism, accepted diminishment, stayed quiet about things that bothered me. But something had changed for me that night at the launch party. The public humiliation had burned away whatever attachment I'd had to playing it safe. I spent my evenings digging deeper into Marcus's digital footprint. His social media analytics were a gold mine of artificial inflation. The pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. Sudden spikes in followers and engagement that corresponded exactly with payments to growth services. I traced the fake followers back to their sources, documented the bot networks that were artificially amplifying his content, found the paid services he was using to buy LinkedIn article views and comments. For someone who'd built his reputation on authentic growth hacking, He'd been remarkably sloppy about covering his tracks. The poetry blog he'd mocked? I'd actually been building something real there. 15,000 followers who genuinely connected with my work about resilience, identity, and finding your voice in a world that constantly tried to silence you. Nothing huge by influencer standards, but authentic engagement that would make any legitimate marketer jealous. I started posting more regularly on the blog, testing the waters with pieces that were increasingly personal. Raw, honest posts about relationships where one person constantly diminishes the other. About imposter syndrome and the difference between confidence and arrogance. About recognizing your worth when others refuse to see it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My DMs filled with messages from women sharing similar experiences. Stories of partners who'd made them feel small, colleagues who'd taken credit for their work, entire systems designed to make them question their own value. My engagement tripled, then quadrupled. Comments poured in from people who felt seen and validated by what I was writing. Other poets started sharing my work, adding their own experiences and perspectives. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that mattered. Not building it for Marcus or according to his definition of success, but creating work that actually connected with people and made them feel less alone. Meanwhile, Marcus was preparing for his next big milestone, the Series B pitch that would determine whether his company survived or scaled. 3 months of preparation, refining the narrative, perfecting the numbers, crafting the story that would convince investors to bet millions on his vision. The same vision I'd helped him articulate. The same narrative I'd helped him develop. The same strategy I'd helped him build, using frameworks and approaches he'd consistently dismissed as not real business thinking. That's when the plan crystallized. I wasn't going to confront Marcus privately or try to have a conversation about respect and recognition. I wasn't going to issue ultimatums or hope he'd suddenly develop the emotional intelligence to see what he'd been doing. I was going to let his own actions speak for themselves. 2 days before his Series B pitch, I published a Medium article titled The Emperor's New Algorithm, a case study in tech fraud and emotional manipulation. I'd spent weeks crafting it, balancing thoroughness with readability, making sure every claim was backed by documentation. The writing was some of the best I'd ever done, clear, compelling, devastating in its precision. I didn't mention Marcus by name. I didn't have to. I laid out everything with the methodical precision of investigative journalism. The stolen code, documented with GitHub, commits and timestamps showing Sarah's actual contributions versus Marcus's claims. The fake social media metrics, complete with analytic screenshots showing bot traffic patterns and artificial engagement spikes. I included side-by-side comparisons of the original thought leadership content he'd published and the work he'd actually copied, sometimes word for word, from other sources. Industry reports he'd plagiarized, frameworks he'd stolen from consulting firms, even motivational quotes he'd repurposed as personal insights. But the most devastating section was about emotional manipulation in professional relationships. How certain people systematically undermine their partner's confidence to maintain control. How they take credit for others' work, while simultaneously dismissing those people as inadequate or unworthy. I wrote about the psychology of professional gaslighting, the way subtle criticism and constant repositioning of credit could make someone doubt their own contributions and value. I described patterns of behavior without naming names, but anyone who knew Marcus would recognize the descriptions. And then, I included the audio. 3 months earlier, after one particularly brutal session of feedback on my writing, I'd started recording our conversations. Initially just to help me remember the specific suggestions he made, to prove to myself that I was implementing his advice correctly. But the recordings had captured so much more than that. I had hours of material. Marcus explaining how my work was cute but not professional level. Marcus taking credit for strategies I'd developed, describing them to friends as his own innovations. Marcus talking about how I was lucky to be with someone who actually understands business. The most damning recording was from the night before his launch party, when he'd been practicing his pitch and had casually mentioned his plans for the future. Once we close this round and really start scaling, I'm probably going to need to think about upgrading my whole situation, he'd said to his co-founder over speakerphone while I was supposedly asleep. Emma's sweet and all, but investors want to see founders with partners who match their ambition level. Someone who brings strategic value to the table. Like a trophy wife? His co-founder had joked. More like a strategic wife, Marcus had replied. Someone who opens doors instead of just being supportive. I'd lain in bed listening to him plan my replacement like I was a piece of outdated software that needed upgrading. Not because I wasn't contributing, but because my contributions weren't visible enough, prestigious enough, impressive enough to enhance his image with investors. I embedded the key clips directly in the article, with full transcripts and context. The audio was clear, unambiguous, devastating. The piece went viral within 6 hours. It started with Sarah sharing it to her network, then spread through engineering and startup communities as people recognized the patterns I'd described. Tech journalists picked it up as an example of broader problems with founder culture and intellectual property theft. Women in tech groups shared it as a case study in professional gaslighting and credit theft. Writers and content creators shared it as an example of how creative work gets devalued and appropriated in corporate settings. But the real acceleration came when someone created the hashtag #NotOnMyLevel, and people started sharing their own experiences with partners, colleagues, and bosses who'd used similar language to diminish their contributions while taking credit for their work. Within 12 hours, the article had been viewed 200,000 times. By the time Marcus woke up for his pitch meeting, it was trending on Twitter, LinkedIn, and even TikTok, where creators were making videos about the audio clips and the broader themes of the piece. I know exactly when he discovered it because he called me 17 times in a row, then sent increasingly frantic texts ranging from anger to bargaining to desperation. How could you do this to me? You're going to destroy everything we built together. This is vindictive and cruel. I can explain everything if you just call me back. Please, Emma, I'm begging you. My pitch is in 2 hours. You know I didn't mean what I said at the party. I love you. We can work through this. This is going to ruin my entire career. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I was watching the metrics on my article climb and reading the comments that were pouring in. Hundreds of people sharing similar experiences, thanking me for putting words to dynamics they'd experienced but never known how to articulate. The pitch meeting was canceled before it officially started. By 9 a.m., 2 of Marcus's key investors had pulled their commitments, citing concerns about leadership integrity and company culture. The TechCrunch reporter who'd witnessed his comment at the party reached out for a follow-up story. We're doing a deeper investigation into workplace dynamics in tech startups, she said when she called. Would you be willing to go on record about your experience? I think my article speaks for itself, I told her. But if you want to investigate broader patterns, I'm happy to connect you with other people who've had similar experiences. By the end of the day, 3 more employees, current and former, had come forward with their own stories of having work appropriated, ideas stolen, contributions minimized. The reporter was building a comprehensive picture of a toxic workplace culture where Marcus consistently took credit for others' innovations while dismissing those same people as not strategic enough or not leadership material. Sarah agreed to be quoted by name in the follow-up piece, sharing her technical contributions and the evidence of her work being appropriated. I thought this was just how startups worked, she said in the article. I didn't realize that healthy companies give credit where it's due. Within a week, Marcus's startup had collapsed entirely. The Series B round fell through when investors discovered the extent of the intellectual property issues and workplace culture problems. Key employees left, taking their knowledge and client relationships with them. The company's reputation was so damaged that even their existing clients started jumping ship. Marcus's personal brand suffered even worse damage. His LinkedIn posts went from confident thought leadership to desperate damage control to eventually just silence. The fake followers I'd documented started dropping off as the platform's algorithm detected the artificial engagement patterns. His professional network, built on borrowed credibility and stolen ideas, began to evaporate. Tech Twitter, never kind to fallen founders, dissected every aspect of his previous claims and public statements. People started going through his old content looking for other examples of plagiarism or credit theft. The pile-on was brutal and thorough. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening to me. The article had resonated with thousands of people who'd experienced similar dynamics in their relationships and careers. My poetry blog exploded from 15,000 to 150,000 followers in 2 weeks as people discovered my other writing and connected with the themes I'd been exploring for years. I started getting messages from literary magazines wanting to publish my work. Speaking requests from conferences about authenticity in digital marketing, recognizing emotional manipulation in professional settings, and building genuine creative careers in a world obsessed with metrics and scalability. 3 different companies reached out offering me head of content positions with salaries that would have made Marcus weep. Not just because of the money, but because they were specifically seeking someone with my combination of strategic thinking and authentic voice. Someone who could build real audience engagement, not just inflate vanity metrics. I chose the position that felt most aligned with my values, a B Corp focused on amplifying underrepresented voices in tech and creative industries. They'd found me through the article and were specifically interested in someone who understood both the strategic and human sides of building authentic brands. "We've been looking for someone who can help us tell stories that matter," the CEO said during my interview. "Not just create content that performs well, but work that actually connects with people and creates positive change." It was the first job interview I'd ever had where my poetry was seen as an asset rather than a liability. Where my ability to write authentically about difficult topics was valued as a core competency rather than dismissed as not professional enough. The final piece of my transformation came 6 months later. I was at a networking event for my new company, genuinely networking this time, not performing the role of supportive girlfriend, when I spotted Marcus across the room. He looked smaller somehow, wearing the same blazer he'd had for years, instead of the designer pieces he'd been buying during his startup's brief success period. He was talking to someone who clearly wasn't interested, doing that desperate networking dance I recognized from his early days. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the slightly manic energy of someone trying too hard to convince people he was still relevant. He saw me, too. Our eyes met across the room, and I watched him calculate whether to approach me or pretend he hadn't noticed. For a moment, he looked like he might bolt. Then his chin lifted slightly, that familiar stubborn tilt that meant he was going to try to control the narrative. He chose to approach. "Emma," he said, attempting that forced casual tone he used when he was trying to maintain control of a situation. His smile was tight, performative. "You look successful." I was wearing a dress I'd bought with my first paycheck from the new job. Nothing designer, but well-made and flattering. I felt confident, grounded, entirely comfortable in my own skin. "I am successful," I said simply. He flinched slightly at my directness. I could see him searching for the right angle, the approach that might give him some leverage in the conversation. "Look, about what happened." "What happened," I interrupted, "is that you consistently underestimated and undermined someone who was actually helping build your career. And when you publicly humiliated me, you discovered that actions have consequences." His jaw tightened. "You destroyed everything I worked for, everything we built together." "I documented what you actually did. The destruction was a natural consequence of your choices, not my documentation of them." "That's not..." He stopped himself, seeming to realize that arguing the point would only make things worse. "I never meant for things to get so out of hand. The article, the recordings. It was vindictive, Emma. You know that's not who I really am." I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine understanding or remorse. What I saw instead was the same pattern I'd watched for 3 years. The inability to take responsibility. The focus on managing perceptions rather than addressing behavior. The assumption that if he could just find the right words, he could convince me to see things his way. "You're right," I said finally. "Publishing that article wasn't who you thought I was. It was who I actually am when I stopped making myself smaller to accommodate your ego." For a moment, we just looked at each other. I could see him processing this version of me. Direct, confident, unapologetic. It clearly didn't match his mental model of who I was supposed to be. "You've changed," he said, like it was an accusation. "No," I said, smiling for the first time in our entire conversation. "I just stopped pretending to be smaller than I am to make you feel bigger than you were." I started to walk away, then turned back. "Marcus, for what it's worth, I hope you learned something from all this. Not about PR management or damage control, but about treating people like human beings instead of resources to be optimized." I left him standing there and rejoined my colleagues, who were having an animated discussion about authentic storytelling and brand building. As I walked away, I heard him call after me, but I didn't turn around. Later, someone asked me how it felt to get revenge on an ex who treated me so badly. I thought about it for a long moment. "It wasn't revenge," I said finally. "Revenge would have been about hurting him for the sake of causing pain. This was about revealing the truth and preventing other people from being manipulated the way I was. The fact that the truth happened to be devastating to his career says more about his choices than mine." That night, I posted a new poem on my blog. He told me I wasn't on his level while standing on a foundation built from my uncredited work, my unpaid emotional labor, my carefully managed silence. He said I didn't understand strategy. While implementing the frameworks I developed, he said I wasn't leadership material. While leading him to every success he claimed, he called my dreams impractical, while his empire crumbled, built on borrowed brilliance and stolen innovation. Turns out he was right about one thing: I wasn't on his level. I was holding it up, and when I let go, everything fell. The poem got 2 million views in 3 days. The response was overwhelming, not just in terms of numbers, but in the depth of connection people felt to the words. My DMs filled with stories from women who'd experienced similar dynamics, men who recognized toxic patterns in their own behavior, young professionals learning to recognize and resist manipulation in their workplaces. A literary agent reached out after seeing the poem, interested in representing a full collection of my work about power dynamics and finding your voice. "There's clearly a hunger for this kind of honest, accessible writing about difficult topics," she said. "Have you thought about turning this into a book?" I had thought about it, actually. Over the past months, I'd been writing more and more about the experience of being diminished and the process of reclaiming your worth. Not just about Marcus, but about all the ways society teaches us to make ourselves smaller, especially women, especially creatives, especially anyone who doesn't fit the narrow definition of traditional success. Sometimes people ask if I regret how everything ended, if I wish I'd handled it differently, tried to work things out privately, been more understanding of the pressure Marcus was under, or the genuine feelings he might have had for me despite his behavior. The truth is, I regret how long it took me to realize my worth. I regret the 3 years I spent believing that someone else's definition of success was more valid than my own. I regret every time I made myself smaller to accommodate his insecurity, every dream I downplayed to avoid his criticism, every accomplishment I minimized to prevent his jealousy. I regret not trusting my instincts sooner, not recognizing the patterns of manipulation and credit theft, not standing up for myself when the problems were still small and potentially addressable. But I don't regret the ending. Marcus taught me something valuable, even if he didn't mean to. The people who try hardest to convince you they're above you are usually standing on the shakiest ground of all. Their confidence is borrowed, their success is inflated, and their need to diminish others comes from a deep fear that they're not actually as impressive as they pretend to be. The experience also taught me the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. For 3 years, I thought I was being a good partner by absorbing his criticism, implementing his feedback, and quietly contributing to his success without asking for recognition. What I was actually doing was enabling a pattern of exploitation and helping him avoid the personal growth that comes from real collaboration and mutual respect. Today, my life looks completely different. I run content strategy for a company whose mission I genuinely believe in, helping amplify voices that have traditionally been marginalized in tech and business. I mentor other women navigating toxic professional relationships, teaching them to recognize gaslighting and credit theft before it becomes normalized. I've published that poetry collection, Not on My Level, and it's been featured in bookstores and literary festivals across the country. The poems explore themes of worth, recognition, and the courage it takes to claim space in a world that constantly tries to shrink you. My new partner, David, is a high school English teacher who makes less money than Marcus ever claimed to make, and has never once made me feel like I need to justify my worth or apologize for my ambitions. He reads every piece I publish and asks thoughtful questions about my work. He introduces me as Emma, who just published an incredible book about finding your voice, and means it. When I showed him my first viral Medium article, he didn't critique my writing or suggest ways to make it more strategic. He said, "I'm proud of you for telling the truth, even when it was scary." That response, pride instead of criticism, celebration instead of strategic analysis, reminded me what healthy support actually looks like.